Hey there, beloved saints. Thank you so much for coming to Thursday's Theological Throwdown. As you know, we are starting this program back up this year. It is not weekly yet, but we're hoping to do about 2 a month as of now. And backed by popular demand, and it's serious demand, we have author Gary Wayne with us tonight. He is the author of the Genesis 6 conspiracy. Look at this. I know it's over 25. I thought it might have been over 30, but we'll ask him how many years of research he has done. And we have discussed the actual Genesis 6 conspiracy on 2 prior programs. If you want to search that on my channel, I will put those in the description box when this goes up, so you can easily access them as well. But tonight we are going to focus on a general topic of secret societies and elite bloodlines, the divine right of kings and the elite families and what it goes back to. And it's a really interesting topic. And so while we are discussing this, if you guys want to know about a particular area or a particular family or a particular thing, like a secret society, for instance, that you really want him to discuss, put it in bold letters in the chat. And so we'll steer the conversation in that direction for you. So with that being said, welcome, Mr. Gary Wayne. We're so happy to have you back.
Well, thank you for inviting me back, and so happy to be guesting on your show and looking forward to not only the discussion tonight, but also answering any questions that people have, as you know, in the chat room. That's always very interesting and sometimes unexpected, but it's also a lot of fun. So hoping people will like what we're talking about tonight and will take an active interest.
Amen. So you're feeling good. I know you had a minor surgery a while back, right?
I did. I'm doing fine, and so been pretty active. I put the book I was writing aside because it just felt like I was pushing uphill and it wasn't coming properly. And I started writing another book that I said I wouldn't write because it's a sequel to the Genesis 6 conspiracy. And I thought anything else that I would write about it would be redundant. But you know, after doing so many shows and listening to what people want more information on, this is what this book is going to be about, is building on what was in the first book, but giving information that I've gleaned over the last, 3 or 4 years as to what people are looking for that, I didn't go into great detail on the book on. I may have touched on, but I didn't go to the detail that I think that they're looking for. So having a lot of fun with that, putting the chapters together. It's coming rather quickly and easily. So
like a commentary companion, because this thing is amazing. And I know you cut several hundred pages already, didn't you?
I did. So some of that's going to go in, and then a lot of the ongoing research, and then matched up with what I think the audience is wanting to get more of sort of a written record on, so that they can keep. Because so many people, when they contact me, they're looking for documents, but they're also saying that the book that I wrote is they use as a reference book and they keep it on their shelf. And so the documents that I'll send them maybe won't be, kept, or they get lost, or they get deleted, or whatever. So I'm thinking more of a permanent record on that is probably a good avenue to do. And so the challenge is going to be able to keep it fresh, so that people say, yeah, it is about the same kind of subjects, but I didn't know this and I didn't know that, and that makes more sense, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the idea behind the book.
Well, I got mine dog-eared in several places. It's fantastic. I mean, the amount of information you have here is just amazing. If you guys don't have one, we put the links up to order his book. He will autograph one for you in or outside of the U.S. So I will make sure both links are there in the description box. I think Ben might actually be putting it on the screen at some point.
Sure.
But if not, we'll put it in the description as well, because it is over 1,000 pages long and it is fascinating. Yeah. My son's aunt stole it for a while, and so she loves it too.
And if people are going to go to the website, there's been I've been getting emails and messages in saying that they're having difficulty bringing up my website. And the common denominator in this age of what's going on with the internet and oligarchical internet companies is that seemingly, if they're not using a Google search engine in the last few months, my website isn't coming up. They get a blank page. So if it comes up blank, then switch switch over to another, over to the Google search engine, and it should come up. And I'm trying to figure out how we get around that so that it's a little bit more.
It's a monopoly. Do you know somebody recently did a search for a specific video on another channel website, right? A whole different website, put that actual channel in, and it still brought up YouTube because Google will always point you to their stuff, and they're blocking. It's a monopoly. They're literally being a monopoly right now.
Yeah, it is a monopoly, and I guess we ought to expect it, although it's not fun as we're going through this, and we'll see. And I'm off all social media now except for Facebook until I try and figure out what's going to be up and who's going to have an audience. And so I'm only on Facebook at this point in time because I don't want to support some of the other social media ones that are all connected to the oligarchs or China. So trying to find my way through that, but I need to keep one open. So I've opted, not because of let's say good character, good performance in my eyes from the Facebook company, but simply because I've got a large following there. People know they can get a hold of me there, and that's the one I'm going to keep open until I slowly transition into other social media.
My son calls America an oligarchy.
It is an oligarchy. It's corporations are free enterprise gone rogue.
Yep.
They should be very highly regulated, and they're not, and it's controlled by the bloodlines, of course, who's always in control with the control of the shares in those large oligarchs. And now what we've seen, which is kind of relative to the show we're talking about, is that you have this dominance of oligarchical left-wing bias, and bias would be a euphemism to what I would really, describe it as, that dominates the boardrooms and the chairman of the board and the CEOs, which you wouldn't have thought would have ever have happened. And in the book, I talk about how that is coming about, and that people don't really realize that these are left-wing oligarchs on the rise. And it started with in America with the funding by the Rothschilds of what I call the Morgan, Rockefeller, and trying to figure out the name that I've missed out of there, but an axis of families that are basically built the corporate America. And there's other secondary families, whether or not it's the Carnegies or whomever, but it's basically, if you're looking to JP Morgan and the Rockefellers, you're hitting the mainstream of that Western bloodline influence to get control over the US economy, the US corporations, and were the sponsors for the Federal Reserve to get control of the monetary policy, so that people couldn't vote people in to do things that they didn't want to see happen. So it shouldn't be as a surprise, although I look at it as a bit shocking now when I look at how all of the oligarchs, who are all left-wing supporting companies, they control pretty much everything. And COVID has permitted them to take another step forward to really grow rich, but also then squash free enterprise underneath.
The other voice.
Yes.
If you have a voice they don't like, they will accuse you of hate speech, shut you down, keep you isolated so you can't get the message to anyone else, remove the videos for some reason, or make it shadow ban you, just not have your stuff show up and you never know it. It's been really difficult. I heard some of those families actually started funding during the start of America. Like, they can trace those families back. With that being said, I wanted you to explain how elite bloodlines and secret societies, those in power, the great 1%, that, the rest of us are just a parentheses in their world. It's their 1% that rule everything here in, this horrific kingdom. But how does that trace back to Genesis 6? For those people that don't know what the Genesis 6 conspiracy is, could you just summarize it real quick and kind of line it up so they know how we're, taking it from there to this subject?
So are you asking about how the current sort of corporation structure links back to the bloodlines and then back to the Nephilim? Is that kind of
How do
the
these
question?
families, these ruling powers,
Right.
link back to this conspiracy?
Yeah, so let's roll it from the beginning, which is a little bit easier to understand instead of peeling back the onion on it, so to speak. So if you look at society as it was before the flood and then after the flood, and continued for the most part that way until the last, say, 200 or 300 years, where you had this experiment with some Western nations in terms of democracy, you had a feudal system that was set up. And you had the very, very poor, that was the servant class, and everything was in a class system. Generally, there's a 4-class system all around the world. And so you have the servant class and the slave class at the bottom, and then you have a small little merchant class that does sort of the business that the bloodlines don't want to do. And then above that, you have the 2 ruling classes, which are the sort of the warrior and governing class, and you have the priest and religious class. So they control all avenues through what I would call the extended family of the bloodlines, of the cousins and the second cousins. And as you go, you get a larger family that is controlling at the top everything that is below. And so this is that feudal system that I was talking about that includes the organizational structure of government and the religion and all the major commerce that takes place. So if you think about what society was before, that's kind of what the reset that they're trying to do to reel the parts of the world that got out of that class system. And so it's really a class warfare reserved for bloodlines of the original Nephilim, who usurped the kingships and took control of the religions with their bloodlines in the beginning. And so these kingships that were established would take over every human kingship or leadership shortly after the flood, until there was Seraphim, which are the post-Diluvian giants that are ruling over each of the dynasties. And anytime you set up a new country, you're setting up a new dynasty. But it's all with these bloodlines, and it takes a firstborn son from the male side, and then a very extraordinary, ennobled female matriarchal bloodline. It's just the fairy bloodline matching with that dragon bloodline of the firstborn to start a new dynasty in a new country. But it's still part of that same bloodline, and that is what came down over the centuries. So you start to roll that forward into, let's say, after 1000 AD, and with the development of the Templars, you have secret societies which are sponsored by the royal bloodlines, working with the religions and working with the kings and the queens and all of the royal families. You're seeing a development of the first major corporation the world had seen. Not only were the Templars the most powerful army of their time, but also they started and pioneered modern banking. And so modern banking is kind of that transnational corporation that they set up, where it permitted the wealthy to travel between countries and not have to take their money with it. So they would deposit their money with a Templar location in let's say in England, and then they could draw from a Templar location in Jerusalem. They also invented modern banking, and they also invented interest rates that were less than the loan sharks or the money traders of the time. And so they grew fabulously wealthy, the most wealthy corporation I think the world has ever seen until maybe just recently with what's going on with some of the tech companies. And this is the banking system that needed to be reestablished after the fall of the Templars. And so you have the Rothschilds being set up, and there were the Bauer family. They changed their name to the Rothschilds when they set up the London Bank to continue with that control of the banking. And they will set up the new Templars within Catholicism, who are the Jesuits. And they're literally called the New Templars. They're set up by the invisible ones, who are the Rosicrucians, which is the main proponent in the highest sort of the lower level organizations of secret societies, still purebloods at the top half, who sponsor a fellow by the name of Ignatius of Loyola in about 1525 or so, and start to fund him to become these new Templars within the church. And then by 1570, from the Montesa order, which was in Spain and took all of the Templar assets at the fall of the Templars and was sponsored by the local king of Spain of the time. He's the one who's been doing the funding for the Jesuits, and he becomes the first. He becomes the third Grand Master, or the third leader of the Jesuits, by 1570. And then, working with the King of Spain, they're going to move and get control of the banking system, and then they're going to move that over to Switzerland. And what's important about that is, at the time, say 100 years or so just before the fall of the Templars, is the Knights of St. John, another initiatory Royal Masonic bloodline that's run by first and second sons of royal families within the church. They set up their organization in Switzerland. And that's why Switzerland has the cross color that they do today, because that's the Knights of St. John one. And so a lot of the money from the Templars that was never found at their falling in 1307 was scurried off to Switzerland. So you had modern banking that started with the Templars being transplanted to Switzerland, and then having the Catholic banking moved over within a few hundred years. And then in the last, say, 50 to 75 years, the Rothschild banking was moved over to Switzerland. So that is the world headquarters for banking. And that's the model of that transnational corporation that the noble elites took with their expanding empires, where they could, at that time, still be protected with the empire, but do business in many, many countries. So like the Hudson Bay Company would be another one, the East Indian Trading Company, and companies like that. They become that operating model of the modern corporation. And then in America, as I was talking earlier, they're funded, the Rothschilds will fund the Rockefellers and the Warburgs primarily, who will fund other families who report to the did I say the Warburgs? It was the Morgan family. That other families that they fund will report to the Rockefellers and to the Morgans, who report to the Rothschilds, who report to the Royal Masons, who funded the Rothschilds. And that's the major corporations, whether or not it's the railroads, whether or not it was mining, whether or not it was hotels, you name it, lumber. They were all working in that same network, setting up these first, and a lot of them weren't corporations at the beginning. They were independently owned, but went corporate with that evolution as they got bigger, so that they could be in control in the background. So the Rockefellers today, for example, would still control over 50 oil companies, which people really don't know. They control it with the shares and with their people they put on the board. So that's how that's all connected. And the corporations in Europe, which was started with the royal elite, are still run by the royal elite. So you have the Dutch royal family that controls the Shell company, and just keep peeling back the onion on no matter what the company is. You're going to go into each country and find out this has a trans-century history of the family that's been running that, and they're always connected to the royal bloodlines. So
wait a minute. So that's why you can see some of these demonic symbols in the logos of these companies.
absolutely, because they are using what I call taciturn language to communicate who they are, what they believe, and what their genealogies are. So that comes through in the names and the imagery for the particular companies. So that's why you see so much occultism,
Like Starbucks.
that like Starbucks, for example, yeah, or Paramount Studios. I mean, it doesn't matter where you go, they are going to either have a name or a logo that, or both, that is going to connect back to the occult, connect back to the bloodlines, and show their history. Just as the coat of arms in the royal families are showing taciturn language of their genealogies as well.
So, you mentioned earlier the Knights Templar and banking. Well, obviously, I was reading how some say they would supposedly protect travelers on their way to visit the Holy Land, and they would loan money because people didn't want to travel with money or something, and they started that kind of thing with the banking. But what most people don't realize, and I wanted to ask you about their demise on Friday the 13th, because it's interesting that they claim to be servants of Jesus Christ. They claim to be Christians, and yet I see so much occultism and that darkness, that secret society darkness around them. And there's a lot of these societies that seem to have a Christian facade over them. Yet when you dig deeper, they actually are polytheist. And I wanted to know, do you know what they actually did? Because supposedly the Pope put, see, I don't believe any of this I believe it's all twisted. The Pope had them executed for pagan rituals that he caught them doing or something. I think all of that was cover up for something else. And I was wondering if you have any information on why they were killed on Friday the 13th. What was the real reason? And were they Christians, even though they were Catholic, Catholic? Did they, were they polytheists really, and occultists? What was going on with the Knights Templar?
Right. So first of all, Friday the 13th is an occult day. So that date was picked for a reason. And the reason isn't because they were accused with heretics, even though that went away within a few years of the charge. That was a ruse because it was a power struggle. And so the King of France, and understand the royal bloodlines control the papacy as well. And you have, a series of French popes that are coming to power and totally controlled by the French king in that period and afterwards. And so the French king needs money. He's got financial issues because of the wars and things that he's been involved on, and so he wants to get all of the money from the Templars, which they don't get because they knew it was coming. And you had a fleet that disappeared with treasures that went over to places like England, or to Scotland, to places like India around the world where they had locations set up. And most of the money went to Switzerland, and the other portions that weren't taken to those locations, as in Portugal or Spain, who were loyal to the Templars even after their fall. They protected their wealth within, let's call them change name Templar societies afterwards, like the Montesa order would be one that I mentioned earlier. So that was a rouge. And it was a pure power play. And the Templars, they actually were so powerful that every monarch feared them. So it's not like a lot of the monarchs were upset that the French king dismantled the sort of the head of the operation, and then used the church with its transnational powers and edicts to excommunicate the Templars and have them hunted down in other countries. So not all of it was, the kings were totally against. A lot of them were for. So who the Templars are is Royal Masons at the adept level. So if you go back to the founding of the Knights Templar, for example, you have de Payan and de Bouillon and Anjou as the major proponents of starting the Templars, and these are the first sons of kings in the Lorraine region of France, so not these poor monks. And everyone in there, except for two who are Cistercian monks, which are Gnostic organizations within the church, based on the Essenes, and of course secret societies take a lot of their organizational structure and things that they do and rituals and things back to the Essenes, which was a polytheist group within the Judaic realm of sects of religion, along with the Pharisees and the Sadducees being the two major ones. So you have these royal Masons who are starting this new organization called the Templars, and then a fellow by the name of Saint Bernard, who is a Benedictine monk and the second most powerful individual, is going to write their charter and give them the Red Cross from a sort of a heraldic order that goes back into prehistory that I won't go into right now for sure, because that's a different rabbit trail. And so this is at the top Royal Masons, just as with the Knights of St. John, who is all run by royal bloodlines as well at the top. It's the group that was set up to protect pilgrims. The Templars weren't. That's another ruse. They were there to excavate the Jerusalem temple site and take treasures and things back to Europe, which they did. And I'll document in the book some of the things that they brought back. And so they're going to set up this organization that is inherited from the Middle East, not from the Essenes, but a lot of that will be part of it, but also how a group that they worked with in the Middle East called the Assassins, who were mystical Muslims, Sufis, had an organizational structure within Islam that was very influential. And this group had adepts of mysticism, because they're polytheists, at the top. And then underneath you had everybody else who were Muslims. And this is the organization that the Templars set up, with the adepts being polytheists and worshiping gods like Baphomet or Baphomet, a satyr, Pan, Azazel type of god at the core. But underneath the adept level and the knight level, and you had to be of royal blood to be a knight in there. So the rest below that are just the servants, and and lower level, because they haven't become an adept yet. So at the top, they're polytheists. Below, they're kind of normal Christians, and it's the same setup that's in Freemasonry today. So one of the qualifications to become a Freemason today is that you have to believe in a God. You don't have to believe in a specific God. You just have to believe in a God, and you have to be invited. So you have to have some bloodlines, or they have an interest on why they're bringing you in. But below the adept level, even at the 32nd degree of the Scottish Rite, which is, very, very close to adept at 33rd degree, they do not know, the true secrets or the God that they're worshiping.
Yeah. My son's grandfather was a Mason, and his aunt was in the Daughters of Job, and his wife, my son's grandmother on his father's side, would constantly tell her husband, please, it's demonic, it's satanic, it's not of God. They don't, and he wouldn't listen till the end. Thank God he got saved on his deathbed. But she was aware of it, but he was completely oblivious to it. You're right. They do not know.
They do not know. And they may have suspicions, but for the most part, they're part of an organization where they're learning things, they're getting together, they're interconnecting, and there's usually good things that lower group is doing for society. But at the core, they're operating seditious plans worldwide. And that's the model that the Templars brought back from the Middle East, that all secret societies are based on. And it's the same setup in the mystical religions. So at the priest level, and probably not at the lower priest level. You would have to be, the head of a church in a region to be sort of an adept. They will, in the polytheist religions, have knowledge that the lower people don't have, and the rituals won't have the same meanings. It'll be more pablum and stuff like that. And so the true secrets and the true bloodlines at the polytheist religious level, have all of the secrets, and they use the lower levels to as I said, as a front, so that they have the protection of that to do the things that they want to do.
I was looking at a documentary on the small sect called Illuminati, and how they claim they disassembled and broke up, but he would get people from the Freemasons, and
Yeah.
it was set up in the same structure. And I know you've mentioned that all of it, because all the pantheons of gods are the same entities, it seems. They just have different names based on what nation is what, and it all goes back to Babylon, the actual city of Babylon.
It does, and the Freemasons, and more accurately, the ancient Masons, which are the Royal Masons, who were running the early post-Diluvian world, beginning at Babel and Nimrod. Nimrod is honored within the Masonic organizations, so Freemasonry and higher, right up into the Royal Masons, as the first Grand Master of Freemasonry after the flood, who imposes the antediluvian religion, and it starts with the knowledge that Hermes, who is kind of his false prophet, with Nimrod being kind of an archetypical Antichrist type figure of the time, is all going to be applied at Babel, and which is sort of implied with working together, that nothing will be prevented from what they can do, and God disperses the people. So when we look at that history, that they go back not only to Babel, but also before the flood, and we start to want to understand how this whole thing's work, we need to understand the Masonic orders, and we need to understand the religious aspect. So in the hierarchy of the secret societies, and I don't know whether I've covered this off on your show or not, so if I have, tell me so I don't go into too much detail on it. Imagine a tree, and an evergreen tree that has branches that come down from the trunk, in sort of that typical kind of evergreen picture. And the trunk is the central organizations. And let's use the old model of the degrees, because it's easier to understand. You have Freemasonry, where you hit at the adept level the 3rd degree. So you're going first, 2nd degree as you're rising up, but you're going to be the 3rd degree as an adept. To run multiple lodges, you have to be a 5th degree. So that's quite a bit higher than a 33rd degree, probably by, multiples of 3, right? In terms of, you take 33, that kind of is divisible by 11. So I'm not quite sure how they do that. But anyways, on the old degree, that's just why it's easier to talk about, is their 5th degree to run lodges. And within the realm of that area of the 3rd to the 5th degree is where the Illuminati is located. So they're higher than the Freemason adepts at 3rd degree, and they're more involved with the bloodlines. And that's why you hear this term, the Illuminati bloodlines, but they're not that high. They may have connections and branches of that go up the tree a bit further, but they're just the 2nd sort of order there, and they have their own agenda as well. So the Freemasons are focused on the army and politics, is where they spend their time. And so you'll have branches that go into them all around this tree that are sort of focused on that. And then the Illuminati are focused on destroying Christianity and world government. And so you'll have organizations that say, like the Skull and Bones, that the Yale universities and similar organizations, where they're drafting bloodlines to go into these initiatory organizations because of who they are, and are going to be moving into politics. So people from the CFR and organizations like that are populated through organizations like the Skull and Bones, and that's why they're typically Masonic, moving up into the Illuminati field. And so the Skull and Bones has Illuminati's imagery. And above the Illuminati is the Rosicrucians. And the Rosicrucians are 50% purebloods. And so they're higher than the fifth degree. And I don't know how many degrees there are. Been told there's 7. Some people have said, no, there's more like 9 or 13. It's hard to know. Could be 11 based on, 3 times 11 for the 33rd degree of the Scottish Rite. So likely about 11. But again, we don't know beyond it because the Royal Mason hierarchy, as you move closer to the top, only allows in purebloods. So that begins at the Rosicrucian level. So you have above the Rosicrucians, you have the Committee of 300. So within these two organizations, as you're transitioning into the Royal Masons of the royal families of the royal elite that you're not seeing visibly because they're working through people like the Rothschilds and Rockefellers and other families, you're going to have organizations, for example, like the Club of 300 that will go into the Committee of 300 that's usually made up of bloodline people they may have introductory lower levels at the bottom half of it, but they've separated the world into 10 groups of nations or trading blocks or spheres of influence for the end time. They're working actively to bring that about, and they funnel into the Committee of 300. The Bilderbergers would be a little bit higher because they have the super ennobled bloodlines like the Dutch royal family and others that are working with people, let's say like Bill Gates and the Clintons and whomever else they invite over for a once-a-year meeting to receive their instructions. So the upper half of that, which are, as the royal families, they're going to probably move into the Council of 33. And then above that you have the main 13 families. And so if you can imagine, let's say other groups, let's say for Freemasonry at the bottom, you may have all of these other lodges that don't have adepts, but they're going to have their people in there organizing them. They handle a lot of those lower level organizations. And as I said, politics and the military, which is why so many people of the military have been Freemasons. And you have, let's say, the Bohemian Grove organization, which is going to intersect into the Illuminati. So you just have to sort of figure out which is the group and where they're going to fit in. And the Jesuits who are inside the church, they're likely going to intersect based on who started them, which was the invisible 33 after the fall of the Templars, who begin all of these other organizations after the flood, and all royals. So you have the black nobility within the Catholic Church as well. So you've got that sort of intersection of what they're doing and their bloodlines that are being run by the religious aspect that's going to connect into, I think, the Council of 33. So it's kind of, you have to understand it that way, and that above the Committee of 300, you have all of these royal Masonic bloodline organizations, let's say like the Seraphim, Knights of the Seraphim, which is the Norse bloodlines, and every sort of group within like a major group of families will have their sort of national bloodline organization. And so just as each, I just want to finish on this point, it'll take me 10 seconds. And so every organization has their specific goal and agenda, just as everybody in the bloodlines, because they're initiated from childhood and they're actually adepts before adulthood, but they're not recognized until they're close to 30. They all have been trained for a specific role within this Leviathan or this web of organizations.
Wow. I did not want to interrupt you. I just didn't want you to go too far because I heard Knights of the Seraphim. Is that
I did. You should Google them. It's the Norse Royal Masonic bloodline or organization.
the chat to know what a seraphim is?
Well, Seraphim is a very high level of angel, part of the watchers that are described in the book of Enoch, which include the cherubim and the Ophanim. And the Ophanim are the angels within the wheels that are talked about in Ezekiel. So the word wheel will go back to Ophan, put the male I am plural, and you get Ophanim. And the seraphim are one of those watchers, and those are the watchers who mated with human females to create the Nephilim and the Rephaim after the flood, if you're a fan of Second Incursion after the flood as well. So as opposed to survival somehow, some way. And these are serpent-faced fiery angels that work before the altar of God. So when the watcher shows up in Daniel 4, they're basically giving the instructions down to earth as to who is going to be running things, or who's going to be the kings and who's going to be the government. So the rebellious watchers do the same thing. And so that would be Azazel, who would have been a watcher. And he would have been a seraphim angel and one of the sons of God of Genesis 6, 1 through 4.
So did you guys catch that? They are, seraph's the root word for serpent also, right?
Yes, it means serpent.
So this is where we would get tales of reptilian type beings that were that are in mythology, that are worshipped. I see the cobra in Egypt, and Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan in South America, the dragon gods and all that. All of that sure ties together.
Sure, because the fiery serpent angels, had wings, and so when they take a shape in the physical world, they're going to be a flying dragon. So when you hear the term Naga, that's what it's being described. And if you Google pictures on it, you'll get very similar type of imagery to what a seraphim is. But I think the best description is the plumed and feathered serpent. And that's what they were, because they had these serpent faces. And that's why you have all of these gods around the world being depicted as dragons, because a flying serpent in antiquity was called a dragon. So these were flying angelic dragons. And why you have that word and imagery also reflected in the cult so much. And they're the ones, the seraphims, who brought the knowledge that merged with the seven sciences that accelerated the antediluvian world into the apocalypse by water, and seemingly similar to what's going on today.
When you go back to the stories of Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan, which I believe are obviously the same entity, they talk about it. You'll see statues of a man inside the serpent's head, right? Because they say he shapeshifted, that he could come in the form of a man, but then his real appearance was a flying serpent.
Yeah. Well, and it makes sense that they could shapeshift. I mean, it's the only way you're going to be able to procreate in the physical world, because they're spirit beings.
That's right.
But and people say, well, we don't really have any evidence of that. We're going, well, yeah, you get descriptions of angels of all sorts of shapes and forms throughout the Bible, including being humans, as in the Sodom narrative. So they can take a physical form, and they can eat and drink and participate, touch within the world. And that all makes sense if you look at, I'll go down a quick rabbit hole, because maybe the audience will appreciate a couple of things they may have not looked at before. You get a verse in Jude 1:6 that's referencing the crimes of the angels before the flood, that they left their habitation. Well, that is the Greek word oikaterion, which means a dwelling place for the spirit. So they left the dwelling place for their spirit. And to interact in the world, you need a dwelling place for the spirit in a physical body, which is the body and the soul. So you got the body and the soul and the spirit that comes from heaven. That's the three aspects that's talked about in the New Testament. And in 2 Corinthians 5, you get oikanterion used one other time as house in heaven. And again, as you link that up with 1 Corinthians, you have, the clothes of heaven and the clothes of the earth. You've got a house or a dwelling place for your spirit in heaven, and a dwelling place in the physical world. And that's what they required to interact with the physical world, which enabled them to procreate and create the sons of God in Genesis 6. And if you roll forward to what happens with Jesus, there's a similar process, because the Word of God is a spirit being, and he is made flesh. So the Holy Spirit creates this situation within Mary to develop the body and the soul, so that the Word will have a dwelling place for his spirit in the physical world, so that he can interact and also be sacrificed for our sins. So it makes sense how they're able to procreate, and why the sons of God, if they were produced from seraphim offspring, would have had a serpentine look to them, just as Akhenaten is depicted if you Google him. And they've lost some of those traits over the years, but in the beginning you have all of these royal families that are being depicted like the gods. And people all around the world are trying to elongate their skulls for millennia afterwards, trying to replicate the demigods who look just like the gods who procreated them. And that's why not only are the gods in the religion burgeoning with serpentine and dragon imagery, but also the kingships, whether it's the cobra or other snakes. It's just part of the whole imagery throughout history. And what they're encoding in that imagery, particularly when it's in the coat of arms, if they're showing a dragon, they're saying that their genealogies are going back to a dragon angel. If they're showing a jackal or something associated with a dog, they're going back to like an Anubis type of angel. If they're showing a lion, they're showing that they're going back to at least in part, because usually they have more than one animal on there, or sometimes they do at least, that they're going back to like a god like Mahis or Nergal, a lion god. And then you have the double eagle that's on a lot of them, and single eagles, and they're going back to like Anunnaki-like angels. All of that is that taciturn language. So it's important to understand the details and how angels had that changeling aspect, which is key to so many things, that if you don't have an understanding of that, you're kind of going, I don't know how any of that makes sense.
Well, when you mentioned the eagles, I immediately thought of Horus, the falcon god of Egypt, and also the those demonic Tengu in Japan.
Yes, and the Tengu are the offspring of Tengu gods who look just like them, right? That's the Anunnaki-like ones. And just as the falcon god, Horus had offspring, so they would have looked just like them. Anubis had offspring as a jackal god who had, a great city of dog offspring or jackal offspring, which are the sort of where the dogmen come from. You've got the lion men of Moab. And so when you start to connect those dots, it starts to make some sense.
Yeah, the linemen of Moab, actually biblical, guys. That's in the Bible. I was going to ask you about them, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. When you talked about the dog people, I've heard and read crazy reports back in the 16s and 1700s. They claimed to have come upon tribes of them where they did not speak, but they walked upright and they had dog-like heads, and they used utensils and all kinds of. These are real men that you would take their testimony as factual, reporting these.
And they go back into history with so many of the historians, whether or not it's Cestius or Herodotus or Pliny. All the major historians document them. And so there's something to it. And there's a lot to it. I actually have a 3-part document on dogmen and dog gods, and then how that does kind of connect back into the Bible, although very, very lightly. You have references that are difficult to sort of overlook, to recognize that maybe this was the case, because these dogmen, for example, were mercenary warriors, particularly as you move further on. And Caleb, as you take that back to Hebrew, means dog. And Caleb was a mercenary from the Kenizzites, which are mysterious people in the Bible as well. And so you get these sort of allusions to um, the dog people. And you got Goliath when David is coming at him, and he's got a slingshot, and Goliath is upset because he thinks he's treating him like a dog. I think a dog, I mean, it's belittled in the Bible, but a dog is in a lower form of Nephilim.
Wow, I wouldn't have connected that at all. I want to ask you something because, I believe that these things literally walk the earth. I believe that the ancients saw things that would give us heart attacks. And these gods that they worship, I believe they were very real to these people. They weren't imaginary. Sociologists, they try to say, it's a personification of this power, it's this, and mythology. But mythology all has a root of truth. And when I look at pagan stories, I can trace like a piece of the truth back to the scriptures, like
Yeah,
or something.
exactly. Yeah.
Filtered through years of a different worldview.
Yeah, and that's what I try and do is I try and measure everything against what's written in the Bible. So when I start to say there's a good possibility of lion Nephilim, we have references in the Bible and gods that would have produced these beings. And in the documents and the link on Facebook where I have the pictures, I'll actually have pictures of these beings on reliefs. And
Wow.
yeah, and that is just amazing to look at. And and people don't sort of connect that King Arioch in Genesis 14 of one of the four kings that are involved in the War of Giants. Is his name means literally out of Hebrew lion-like.
Oh, wow. Wow.
So
I saw them walking them around on leashes too. You can see them carved, or the human head and the lion's body.
yes, yeah, yeah. There's several different kinds of lion type creatures. All were warriors. Some of them had a lion's head and a human body. Some of them had a lion's body and a human head, and a few that are kind of in between. But those reliefs are absolutely scary and kind of spectacular. And you look at those creatures out of Southeast Asia, particularly in Japan, where the record is so strong, and that's where they also say they get the martial arts from. No surprise there, because these were the warrior and the governing class and the priest class. But they are freakishly close to depictions of the Anunnaki or the Horus god. And then you have the Xibalba out of the Quiché Maya. If you're not familiar with them, they were, again, demigods that lived in the underworld and offspring of the gods and sort of vampirish in what they did. So they drank blood. And their descriptions match these Tengu. But what's really interesting about the Xibalba is they have the house of Camazotz that the Popol Vuh also talks about. And the house of Camazotz is the house of the bat. And this was a branch of the bird Nephilim that looked more like bats. So if somebody were to Google right now, Camazotz, Camazotz, you're going to get an image that comes up where you have this image of like a mask, almost a mask kind of human with this sort of body built that looks exactly like the Batman outfit in the superhero movies. So yeah, unbelievable. But that's because most of the superheroes that we have today are based on giants, different kinds of giants in prehistory, and the chimera effect of changing DNA and creating special powers that was also prevalent before the flood.
Well, yeah, I mean, even the Bible said that these were men of renown. They were known in all the ancient world in their fame.
Yeah,
So
they were heroes. They were heroes of old, as they're described in Greek mythology. And in some English translations, you won't have mighty one in Genesis 1:6-4. You'll have, or in Genesis 6:4, I mean, instead of mighty ones, you'll have heroes of old. Hero was the offspring of a god and a human female. And
Mm,
just as demigod is defined as the offspring of a god and a human female.
mm.
So these heroes that the superheroes are based on go right back to the ancient meaning of hero. And so let's take Superman as a classic one. His whole name, not Clark Kent, but Jor-El, son of Jor-El, unless I've reversed that, but one's the father, one's the son. He's from the house of El, El.
Oh God.
El is Hebrew for angel or God. And in the Canaanite pantheon, that's the main god. That's the head parent god, El, and Baal is his offspring. So you can have an analogy that this Superman, superhero, is actually a antichrist type figure, as in Baal.
Wow. Yeah. Well, since we don't wrestle in its flesh and blood, I think people are inspired by spiritual things.
Yes.
So it would certainly make sense. I want to go back to the blood drinking thing because it's something I read in your book. But I wanted to ask you a question. It might sound weird. I was researching just bizarre eyewitness accounts of adventurers. Like I was telling you, I saw where they had written about the dogmen. This is one creature I haven't heard about much, but supposedly they do not have a head, just a human torso, and their
Yeah.
face on their actual chest torso. Starts with a B, a bloomy or bloom eye, or I forgot what they're called. Do you know what I'm
Yeah.
talking
I've seen them, and you're right. That name is very, very close to that. And Pliny actually talks about them, and I think Ctesias as well. And out of Africa, mostly is, if my memory serves me correct on that. I've not got anything that I've been able to trace it to,
That is bizarre.
but it is absolutely bizarre when you look at the pictures of that, and it's actually based on people that have some sort of race that has their face in their stomach.
Yeah, that's so you guys, what it basically is these people, they differ, but they have no head. Okay. They have no neck or head. They have nothing but a torso. They have 2 hands, 2 feet, but their eyes and mouth are either on their chest or, like he said, in their stomach area. And there's reports of these things from, like, was it Pliny the Elder, you said, that
Yeah.
reported?
Yep.
Yeah, so I had not heard much about them, and I knew you would have heard of them, and I was just wondering, that's got to be just some bizarre genetic experiment gone completely wrong. But there's not too many reports of them. But going back to the blood drinking thing, and I'm thinking about the Mayans and the bat, and they had a big underworld thing going on too, where a lot of these entities you had to go through, just like the Egyptians did in the Book of the Dead, where they have to go through all these trials in the underworld or whatever. And when you talked about blood drinking, it made me think of I was surprised to hear the Tengu type were the blood drinkers, because I immediately think back to the reptilian that are known for human flesh and blood. And you wrote something about Cain and his mark and how that has something to do with it together. I want to understand, what do you
Sorry
think
about that.
may have been, and how does this tie together, the blood drinking?
Just hang on a second.
Puppy.
Yeah.
Puppy.
So can you, I couldn't really hear the question.
Oh, the mark of Cain, and blood drinking,
Yep.
and what is how does that tie up? How does that factor together? And what do you think the mark may have been?
Well, there's a lot of different views on what the mark is, and the Rosicrucians believe it is like an orbus with a dragon or another symbol or a cross in the middle, depending on which version that you're talking about. There's a book that comes out of the Manichaean Book of Giants that derives from the Enoch Book of Giants, and it's called the Book of Lamech. and it's not scriptural. And but it describes the mark of Cain as being this bleached white skin. So there's lots of different views on it as to what that mark is. But one of the keys is the blood drinking that goes through all of the occult histories amongst the adepts and amongst the various giants. And they're said to drink blood because it helped extend their lives, and it also gave them some additional power, and it also gave them better cognitive abilities. And so in Genesis 6:3, right in the middle of the giant creation story that leads into the flood, you have God stepping in and limiting life to 120 years. I think that's God taking away the ability for a physical body to last forever on the earth as a physical god or a demigod in the physical world. And giants, particularly the giants from the Seraphim angels, from the Watchers, they would not only eat humans, but they would drink their blood on a regular basis. And so they're deriving, I think, some additional years from that, or at least that's what they believe that would happen. And they probably do it because there's probably something to that. And the other association in there is the massive human sacrifices and other sacrifices that were done on these great altars to not only the gods, but to the demigods. And within these altars, you have these tracts that would have the blood drain. And everybody assumes that that blood was drained and went to the earth. And so in the nature sort of polytheist pabulum that people get served up, that the earth would suck up that blood just as the earth sucked up the blood of Abel, who Cain killed. That's just allegorical stuff. I think they were actually collecting the blood in these big buckets. And I think they had almost like blood orgies of drinking this blood amongst the elite because of all the different things that they believe are in the Bible and or in the blood. In the Bible, we're told the life is in the blood, and that these laws were drawn up as a number of the eating rules were drawn up because they were sins of the Nephilim. And so drinking blood is one of those. Eating food sacrificed to idols is another one. Strangling is another one. So these are all crimes that the Nephilim did. So this is an active part of secret societies even to this day. And so it's a bit of speculation, but when you look at all of the different blood banks that have been set up, and they're always requiring more blood, it's a lot easier to take blood out of blood banks when you control those organizations, which they do, than it is to be, slaughtering people en masse to get that access to the blood for their rituals and for their blood drinking for cognitive ability. So roll that forward as an understanding of how this comes through more into our age as a transition. Vlad the Impaler is a Tuatha De Danann descendant or a Rephaim descendant, and he is a red hair, pale skin, hazel-eyed royal bloodline of Transylvania. And coincidentally, this is who Prince Charles says he takes one of the peoples he takes his genealogies through as he tracks it back into prehistory. He is also a mystic that's educated at the University of Solomon in Vienna, and part of an order that is started by the Rosicrucians, which are the first sort of branch out of the reformalizing of secret societies after the fall of the Knights Templar. So starting in about 1400, you get the Sarkani Rond that is established, which is the Ordo Draconis is the other name for it, and Vlad the Impaler is the character Dracula is based on. And he not only had that pale skin, but he was a night operative and was active in drinking blood for those cognitive abilities. And so you overlay all of that onto the Dracula vampires stories as being the enemies of Christians, and you get the classic archetype of a allegorized bloodline of the Nephilim, and who are drinking blood, complete with the cobra fangs to do the biting with. And what's interesting about the word Dracula, it actually means son of Dracul, with the A means the son. So, and Dracula is based on the Greek words for dragon, drakonta.
So he's literally the son of the dragon.
He's literally the son of a dragon, yes.
It's interesting to me because all these rulers claim to have been part of the Catholic Church. They claim to have been, I guess, Christian for that time period. But yet their actions and what they were involved in is the furthest thing. It seems more like ancient paganism, because blood rituals seem to be the active ingredient in every pagan community. If you look back, no matter where it is in the world.
So it was just easier with all the things that were going on and the politics that was set up with Constantine, with the homogenization of Mithraism, Egyptian religion, and Christianity, and probably a couple other ones thrown in there, to create a state-sponsored religion to unite the country under that religion. But you know that the Caesars and the rulers were, bloodline Nephilim. They took their bloodlines in Rome back to Romulus and Remus and that whole occult legends. And you just know that they were practicing their polytheism in secret. And so did the kings down the road. And where they run into trouble, where not that you had too much Christian religion that's being demonstrated by some of the kingships that started some of the wars, let's say with the Jacobite wars and the Catholic and Protestant kings and back and forth that went on in England. It was the power of the Roman Church that was being more concerned with, not the idea of a Catholic sect. It was who was really running Roman Catholicism at the top, that were, basically run by the black nobility. So it was that power struggle that was going on, that was all polytheistic at the core.
So when you say black nobility, we're talking about the kings and the rulers, I immediately jump to the infallibility of kings and how now they've transferred that to the Pope. The infallibility of the Pope, which is an ancient decree. That's why in the book of Esther, he could not rescind the order because he can't say he's wrong ever. And so this went over to the Pope, and it's held to this day. It is not based on anything biblical. Obviously, the head of our true church is Jesus, not the Pope. So where does that all trace back? Did the emperors just turn into instead of the Roman Empire and the emperors, did the Pope just become the Holy Roman Emperor? Is that basically what happened?
No, you have the religious part of the organizational structure, which is all run by the bloodlines, and you have the governmental aspect, and you have the warrior aspect, and usually the warrior aspect is connected into the ruling king and queens. So you have those two pillars, and both of those come down from the Seraphim as controlling both arms, and so answering back to those watchers. And where I'm going with this is they both come about that divine right of rule through the various branches, one religious, one governmental. And so if you think about the kings of the Unicorn dynasty of Stuart, and King James in particular, the one who sponsored the King James Version Bible to, without coincidence, to unite the English kingdom because there were so many religious factions. So he was using the same sort of thing that Constantine was doing by merging and making Christianity the state-sponsored religion. He's doing something similar on a smaller scale. He proclaimed the divine right to rule, as did his kings, and they claim that right as the offspring of the demigods, or the descendants of the demigods, and the offspring of the Baalim after the flood, the Baalim of Mount Hermon, the Baalim of the Council of Gods. And with the Council of Gods, you have the antediluvian council and you have the post-diluvian council. And most of the antediluvian council were populating the earth with their offspring, and they went to the abyss, so they needed to be replaced after the flood. And so the Rephaim, who show up after the flood, are the offspring of Baal and the Baalim. And by the way, Baal is Al, in the last half of Baal is a transliteration for El, and Al out of the more Sumerian and Mesopotamian region was where that Al translation or transliteration for El comes from, as an angel or a god. That's the Baalim that Baal is the head of, ruling from Mount Hermon after the flood, or the Council of the Gods. And if they created a second incursion, and I think they did after the flood, they're the ones, they would have also been removed and sent to the abyss. So we start to get an answer through that sort of thought process as who are the parent gods, who are the offspring gods, why did the parent gods disappear, even though they would have been rebelled against by their offspring gods, but you can't kill a god, so where did they go? Well, it's interesting in the Gospel of the Pistis Sophia gospel out of Gnosticism, they actually show these parent gods that, are kind of best depicted. If somebody Googles the Ogdoad gods out of Egypt, Ogdoad, you get all of these different shapes. These are the kinds of parent gods that are in the abyss in the Gnostic Pistis Sophia gospel. And so I think that's why they disappeared, and that's why Baal takes over from El. It's not that they killed him, because they can't kill an immortal being. Only God can do that. So Baal takes over after the flood, the Baalim and the Council of the Gods that Psalms 82 talks about. And then I think they disappear as well. And that's when you see almost no sort of interaction between those gods, for the most part, and Earth, even though they're still ruling the Earth, as Satan is still the god of this world that council would answer to in the physical world. And people start to sacrifice, that is recorded in the Bible, and Israel in particular, to the demigods. And that is the Rephaim and their roaming spirits once their body died. So you see that transition coming down through history. And I don't think all of the fallen angels went to the abyss, but they're certainly not interacting like they did shortly after the flood or before the flood.
You think they will in the last days?
Oh, they definitely will in the last days, yes.
Now, I have questions about bloodlines, but in the beginning of our conversation, we were talking about the Knights Templar, and you mentioned Islam, and then you were talking about Dracula, and I know he fought against the Ottoman Empire for that as well. So I have heard rumors. Now, I know we can trace Allah back to the moon god, one of the 360 idols at Mecca, and Allah had 3 daughters, Manat and 2 other ones. And even Muhammad said you can get messages to Allah through these 3 cranes, his daughters. And the pagans were like, yay. And they're like, no, you can't do that. That's shirk. That's assigning partners to God. That's why they reject Christianity, right? Because God has no sons, they say. So we can see it's pagan. That's why they walk 7 times. It's the wandering stars and planets that they're going around 7 times to worship the deities in the sky. They don't know that, but they do. And so I know I call it religion soup, because there's little bits of what try to put Old Testament figures into their religion. They try to put some maybe Gnostic Jesus stories, and then Ramadan, which was a pagan fast thing before Islam. So was this actually promoted by the Catholic Church. I have heard people say that the Catholic Church was involved in creating and or promoting Islam.
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation on that. I've researched that hard. I cannot find any connections between the Roman Church creating Islam, and it seems counterproductive.
I
I
thought
mean,
so.
most of that area was Christian before Islam came along.
Right.
Right. So it took away from a lot of their power and their followers. So I'm not really convinced of that. So Islam, though, no matter what people think about it, it's turned into an organization that's led by leaders who, as you say, do a lot of polytheist things because they've been influenced significantly by the Sufis, who are like the Kabbalists within Judaism and the Gnostics within Christianity. And so whatever Islam was in the beginning, whatever your beliefs are, I understand it's been heavily influenced through the ages on that. And then you've got different sects who have different hadiths, and so they have different beliefs, and those are all oral traditions. So you've got the leadership that is absolutely atrocious, in my opinion. And so, but the word Allah, you want to be kind of careful with that. Yes, there was a Mesopotamian moon god by that name, but Allah is just part of that whole transliteration for that generic word for God.
Yeah, I've heard that that is just the Arabic word for God.
Yeah,
But
but
I
but here's where I sort of fall against that in terms of what they're believing and what they're saying. I know words will have a little bit of different meaning as they transliterate into other languages, but when you put an AH on the end of al, as in Baal at the end, and al is that transliteration for L, and Allah is one of those transliterations, that actually, that AH is denoting a female suffix. Right? And I'm going, that just, that doesn't fit. I mean, period. I mean, so it would be like us writing in English for the transliteration of God as goddess, right?
Well, they have
And
and a star, so maybe it's
and, and a star. But well, understand that the star and the moon that goes with Islam actually was taken over when they took over Constantinople. So it was actually part of some of the paganism and Christianity that also is there. So, and an interesting sort of analogy on why I'm saying that, if you look at the word Gibberim, which is the mighty one that people would, but it's male plural with the I am male plural. As Seraphim is male plural with the fallen angels or the cherubim. And the word that falls after Gibberah, Gibberim 1368 is 1369, which is Gibberah, which is the AH male plural. And it's actually used a few times, but more of an action of power in the book of Daniel. So it's a common understanding that's a female suffix that's on there. And I find that absolutely unexplainable.
Yeah, it's strange. I don't know how that would work. And you mentioning names, I'm not trying to confuse people, you guys, but his book is amazing, and every time he says something, I think about something else in the book. You're talking about Allah being a generic word and the name of a pagan moon god. And since he mentioned those three crane daughters, I believe he was referring to the pagan moon god when he did this, when he started this. And then said Satan tricked him into delivering that message. It's abrogated. But you have a chapter in your book called Adonai, and I am concerned because I hear a lot of debate. Now, I don't call God by a Hebrew name. I call him Father in the name of Jesus. That's how I know him. I don't condemn anybody that does. But the words spelled with the Hebrew letters Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey People pronounce it all kinds of different ways, but they weren't allowed to speak it out loud. And so they replaced it with what? A generic word for Lord or something. What was the issue with that? The chapter in your book was fascinating. And I know this question came up for you in the last time we were here. We didn't get to it. Some people say that Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is Yahweh, and Yahweh is actually a Canaanite god. And then others say it just means I am that I am, or he that creates. So I just want to know what you think about
so Yahweh, and I'll just use this most simplest way of saying, I mean, it really means I am, just as it's described in the book of Exodus. And there's a few components in terms of how the word is put together, but the word Adonai, it means in Hebrew, my Lord, and it's used something like 427 or 429 times in the Hebrew Old Testament manuscripts legitimately, and should be translated legitimately as my Lord. But if you look at the King James Version Bible, you have Yahweh translated as my Lord something like over 6,000 times. And that's the typical reason, is that people say that, well, the Jewish people weren't permitted to pronounce God's name. Okay, fair enough. But choosing my Lord is very suspect for that translation. And here's why. When you look at the secret societies and the Gnostics, and that they may have had an imprint in the original translation of the King James Version Bible, aka as a segue, Lucifer in Isaiah 14:12 is an Italian word inserted for the Hebrew word Hail El. And most angels' names end in EL. And I'm thinking that is for one of Satan's names that he would have had before he was degraded to Satan status. And I say that because the God of the Bible is known within Gnosticism by several different names. Sometimes you might hear Iel de Boath, an offspring of Sophia, just as Demiurge is considered to be Iel de Boath. But they're also known, they also call, particularly the Gnostics and the secret societies, call the God of the Bible Adonai. And the reason why they do that is what they would consider a slur against God, because they consider Baal my Lord, just as you derive that out of Hebrew meanings. And for me to translate my Lord that many times for Yahweh, I mean, they could have used generic God, right? Just like other translations do, but they chose my Lord because I think they were translating from their bias and inserting some of their own religious beliefs into the King James Version Bible, just like you have Easter in Acts 12:4, which makes no sense because the Greek word is Passover, and just as it's used throughout the rest of the New Testament. And people say, well, that's because they were pagan by then, the Jewish people. Well, that's just a few years after the crucifixion. That doesn't make any sense. And if they were pagan, then they certainly wouldn't have been celebrating the Feast of Unleavened Bread that's used in verse 3. It doesn't make any sense. They're markers that they put in. So, and then Adonai, also, as you take that in transliterations, goes back to, instead of a D for Adon, goes back to a T for Aten. That comes out of the Egyptian pantheon. And I got a problem with my camera. I just need to fix. And so again, they link back to the Aten as being the source of the monotheist religions, because they actually believe, and I track that belief on how they get there in my book, that Akhenaten, who converted Egypt to the sun-worshipping Aten god, was actually Moses, and Moses brought polytheism to Israel and to the land of the covenant, that all three monotheist religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, as they're described as monotheist religions worshiping one God, are rooted in. So the idea is to cut monotheist religions off at the sort of neck, at the Moses level, and convert them in the end time over to the universal church. And they'll use a few other, obviously some other things as well, but expect part of that. So that whole play with my Lord and Adonai is something that people need to be aware of.
So you went right by it, and I have never heard that before, that the possibility of, because I've never heard of a pharaoh leaving the pagan pantheon and going to just one god. And they tried to remove him and all the statues. There's still some of him, but they tried to remove all the glyphs of him. And they claim it was Akhenaten, and he worshipped Aten, the sun god or whatever. But maybe it was the S-O-N, not the S-U-N, the possibility that Moses brought it.
Yeah, no, you see, that's the misdirection, not what you're just saying, but how you might easily go there with it by deduction, but it's based in their misdirection. So when he worshipped the Aten god, he was worshiping the Aten god at the top of the pantheon, as opposed to the Amun god.
I see.
He wasn't banishing the other gods and going to a monotheist religion. He just raised one god up to be the leader god and reduced Amun back to the other gods within the pantheon. So it's not monotheistic in any way.
Well, that's narcissistic, because he believed himself to be the incarnation of the sun god. So of course he'd raise the one up that he thinks he's the personification of. So
absolutely.
It's self-worship he was doing there. He's promoting self. I see. Okay. Yeah, but you're right about misdirection, and it's important that we know that. The reason I wanted the chat to hear this, you guys. I believe the reason you'll hear these people say, "Oh, Christianity's just another religion," is, look, it's just like this. They were born of a virgin. Or it's just like that. They rose from the dead. But when you investigate it, there's not many similarities at all. And what is there is based on scriptures and prophecies that were written long before Jesus even came and Satan knew about. So he corrupted this message and made it pagan as much as he could. And it does not discount the truth of Christianity. But these things can try to trip you up. I've seen people have their faith shaken, thinking that these ancient pagan gods had similar stories, virgin birth, rose from the dead, et cetera, and they get really shaken up over it. So I'm glad you mentioned the misdirection there.
Well, and that resurrection aspect is another classic misdirection. So, and they say, let's say gods like Mithra, which was born on December 25, which is why you have the 25th that was set up for the birth of Jesus, when we know he was born in probably September, late September, early October. Won't go into the details of all of that, but
the sheep
Mithra,
are out.
Tammuz, and so many other gods that they say resurrected like Jesus, that is not accurate or truthful. It's misdirection. And what happened is that you're talking about demigods whose bodies died. These were Nephilim and Rephaim, demigods, kings, rulers who died. And in their belief system of reincarnation, their body is going to leave, their spirit is going to leave, and they're going to go through all of these machinations of evolvement into godhood. But all that is happening with these demigods is that the body died, just as with Nephilim, as we understand it, that when their bodies died, their spirits were not permitted to go to sleep like humans do until the resurrection process, nor were they permitted into heaven. So when that spirit rose, as with all Nephilim, it roams the earth looking to possess people to interact with the world again. That's not a resurrection. That is wandering spirits in dry places, as Jesus talks about. And the only way they can rest or interact is to possess people.
Well, speaking of possession, the gentleman in the chat, I know I didn't want to keep you too long tonight. I mean, we could go on forever, but I'm praying you'll come back again. The gentleman in the chat was saying, well, if the Nephilim, did they all die in the flood? Are they around today? And I wanted to let him know that's why we're discussing it, because he's telling us how they have continued, in a sense, through these elite bloodlines and secret societies, how it goes back to that. So did you want to give him some info on the
Sure, yeah. So I mean, what we have is the descendants of the Nephilim and the Rephaim today, at least according to their genealogies. I think more descendants of the Rephaim. So you've got the demon spirits as these wandering spirits, and some of them actually were put into the abyss. And we know that because in Ezekiel 31:32 and Isaiah 14 and a couple other chapters, you have the terrible ones that are being talked about, and they're locked inside or alongside the abyss in these cells alongside the abyss, as Ezekiel talks about, because when they were still alive, they created terror on the earth. So these are the worst of them that are in the abyss, and they'll be returning in the end time. But the rest of them still roam the earth. So I would expect as technology moves forward, they're going to create cloned bodies for these beings to interact with the world. I also would not be surprised that if there was not a third incursion of creation of giants, or we create the new man concept through science and DNA manipulation, because I do believe that Nephilim are going to impact the end time in a significant way. And so somehow, some way, they're going to show up, and it's probably going to be in addition to the bloodline descendants. And if you go to Daniel 2:43 and look at that interesting verse as it's translated in the King James Version Bible, and it's talking about the descendants of the metallic dynasties who are going to mix their seed with the seed of humankind in the end time. And that's just a bizarre, they're going to mingle their seed is the exact wording on it. And that indicates that there's going to probably be Nephilim. So how do they come about? Well, they're either going to be recreated, or somehow, some way, they were saved, put in stasis, kept in the earth, off the earth, but somehow, some way have survived throughout the millennia to resurface again in the end time. So in my book, I lean heavily to the descendants, but I'm also open to the idea that you're going to have these giants, may also have these giants show up in the end time. And I look at what Jesus said, because I always like to go back, particularly in prophecy, on what Jesus said, put everything around what he said and not vice versa. And he said, as it's translated into English out of Greek as opposed to Hebrew of the Old Testament, is that the days will be like the days of Noah. And as the word of God, he would use the perfect words, and that translation is perfectly accurate, just as those are the same words that are used in Genesis 9:29 for the life of Moses. It says, and the days of Noah were. And I think that is part of that overarching sign that we need to be aware of what happened. And in the days of Noah were 350 years after the flood and 600 years before the flood. And you have giants before the flood, and you have giants after the flood. And you have this antediluvian religion that resurfaces at Babel after the flood, which is the allegory for the universal religion in the end time. And you have that whole scenario of Babel as that archetypical end time scenario with an Antichrist type figure, a false prophet in Hermes, as the Masons believe, and you also have that universal sway of religion over Babel. And that's the daughter of Babylon religions that come down through the beast empires and the metallic empires, and will resurface in the end time with that mother goddess as a significant part. And that's why the woman is shown there. So I know I'm going down too many rabbit holes here, but just to answer the question is, I do believe that we're going to see them in the end time. And if we look at that Gog and Magog war, Gog and Magog are the descendants of Gog and Magog. But what's interesting about Gog and Magog is those are giants in the antediluvian time that were the offspring of the god Iapetus, just as Albion is the other one that's matched with when you get those Gog and Magog over in England. And I think you've got two things going on there. I think you have the alliance of countries that are going on, but I think they're going to be led by Antichrist type figures, because Gog, both in Hebrew and in Greek, goes back to an allegory as part of its meaning for an Antichrist type figure in the end time. So I think that's a connection that not only will Antichrist have these Nephilim and Rephaim bloodlines and pedigree that he's going to present, there'll be other rival bloodlines with a pedigree as well, with these alternative Antichrists, just as Jesus tells us in the first book of John and in Mark 13 and Matthew 24, there will be Antichrists as in plural.
Well, when Jesus says it was in the days of Noah, people look at the days of Noah. Yes, it was wicked. So was Sodom and Gomorrah. And people just got married. Like I said, they got married. They weren't paying attention. They didn't think anything bad was going to happen. That could be it too. But the only thing definitively different, because there's always been wickedness, there's always been sexual immorality, pagan gods, people being godless and lawless. The only thing in the time of Noah that stands out from any other wickedness is this Nephilim giant thing.
Yes, I think two things actually stand out. One is the giants, both sides of the flood, right? But you also have, before the flood, a corruption of the earth, which is the Hebrew word shakath, which means to ruin, to decay, to destroy. And the whole earth was corrupted. And that would mean both the plant world and the animal world, and most of the humans had their DNAs and genomes corrupted. And we're just coming to that level of technology today. So I think that's both of those. As we get closer to the end time, the earth is going to be corrupted again.
Yeah, I get joked on by people that don't believe this. They don't believe this supernatural event. And when it says Noah was perfect in his generations, I tell him it's not that he was perfectly righteous. The generations there, what's the word, tamim, or it's what they use to inspect the lamb to make sure it's without any physical deformities. So perfect in its generations would mean it was not corrupted, as you say.
Yes, and selected for the truth. And people wonder why the unicorn, if it ever existed, and of course it shows up in the King James Version Bible, but the actual Hebrew word is rem for wild bull, and the unicorn's in there for the King James unicorn dynasty, and to set up his pedigree, right? But the unicorn in the mythos was these playful little horsey type characters, not a bull with a single horn, that were playing and missed going to the ark. They weren't called to the ark because they weren't that. They were, in their mythos, these giant horse chimera type beings that had, not only horse-like, but they had different type of hooves and other animal features to them. And they were the stallions in the mythos that the Nephilim warriors and kings rode into battle. And so they were a corrupted form, which is why they weren't called to the ark, because only the representatives of the species that weren't corrupted
Right.
is my understanding of how I read the flood story, that we're called to start the earth anew with uncorrupted species.
Well, I know Enoch is not, we don't consider it canon or inspired, but I believe it's got some historical truth. And the first century Jew would have certainly understood what these things meant. And they would have understood Jude talking about the angels who didn't keep their first estate, and Peter talking about them being in Tartarus. And they would have gotten this. And
Yes.
it's amazing to me because it really goes into detail about how that he messed with insects and every kind of animal, with the fish, with humans, and they defiled every type of genome there was.
Yes.
I think we can see these, some of them fossilized. You'll see like ridiculously large insects or dragonflies, like 6 feet wide or whatever. And I often wonder, since when they made it with humans that they became so massive, if the same thing didn't happen. It also mentions that the fallen ones can change shape in order to literally mate with these animals, and that's another reason bestiality is prohibited. I mean, obviously it's just unnatural, but also because they had actually done that and had created these crazy creatures.
Yeah, and that's also why it's one of the laws, again, not to crossbreed animals,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there was that kind of thing going on, however it was done, and I think it was done in a number of different ways.
Sure. Well, the horse people, what are they called? The Centaurs.
Yep.
They were said to have been created in a cloud, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
it could have been some kind of spiritual place where they did genetic stuff like these so-called aliens do and stuff like that.
Well, here's an interesting thought. So a centaur is an offspring, obviously part human, and something to do with the fallen angels, sexually or otherwise, and an animal, as in a horse. So 3 parts, which is not typically how we would look at the makeup of a Nephilim. But in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim and Enkidu and Gilgamesh and all of those giants are considered 1/3 human and 2/3 God. So
Mm,
one wonders whether or not there was some sort of ability to separate within that DNA or sexual
sure.
copulating, because angels are shapeshifters. If they took, two kinds of forms there, I guess, that they could lay all of that in. And so one wonders, based on what it talks about in the Sumerian, that, you could have those 3 components.
Well,
And then,
you mentioned that before, the
yep,
gatekeepers that are part crab, part
yep.
and part something else. They guard the gate of the king or something.
Oh,
Yeah.
the Akrababalu.
Yes, that's it.
Yes, the scorpion beings that are described exactly as the things that come out of the abyss.
Oh, crababaloo. That's why I
Yeah,
said crab, but it's a scorpion.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah. So the Hebrew word for scorpion is akrab, with Aqrab, and then the Malu part is the Sumerian prefix that goes on. They're also called the Gerdabalu as well in Sumeria. And they're created by the parent god Tiamat, which is a Leviathan-like creature in the pantheon and part of the parent gods. And she created them to keep the offspring gods like Anki and Enlil and those in line, because they're afraid of being overthrown by the offspring gods, which they are. And I don't think they actually were. I think it's because the parent gods went to the abyss because of what they did on creating these types of creatures, like Tiamat did with the scorpion beings. And they were there, they had the ability to destroy the world. And they're
what?
known in most cultures, yeah. So these were very, very powerful beings, and they're described exactly as they're described in Revelation 9, and they're coming out of the abyss. So, yeah. So I'm not, I can't really find out how she created these things, but she's a lot like Bast in the Egyptian pantheon, which shows up in the Black Panther movies that they honor as the goddess there. And Bast, kind of opened up Pandora's box and created all of these same kinds of creatures in the Egyptian pantheon as Tiamat did. So this was common, that there was some gods that created these horrible kind of chimera type beings. And, you look at King Hambada of the Cedar Forest in the Epic of Gilgamesh. He's got several kinds of animals that are part of him, and this is after the flood, and including lion aspects. And he's in the Cedar Forest, which is at Mount Hermon, and he's called the terrible one, just as the Rephaim are, because he's supposed to do, his whole assignment is to do terrible things to the humans, not to the giants, to the humans.
Wow. Yeah. Every time I think of it, I think about the chimera, how it had a snake tail and like a lion or leopard body, and then a goat's head hanging out the side, and just crazy. It had to.
Serpent tails and
But there's got to be some truth to this, and Leviathan obviously is a demon. And it's just weird when we can find parts that we know are true in our scriptures, and then go to these pagan nations or polytheistic nations and see their worldview is completely opposite. But we know there's some truth to what they're saying.
Well, and I have a chapter devoted to Leviathan because it's a story that crosses all cultures again. You have God that kills the female Leviathan in the Bible that has multiple heads, right? And crushes the skull. And in Isaiah, the other Leviathan is to be killed in the end time. Now, let's say in the Sumerian and Mesopotamian pantheons, you have similar figures like Tiamat that are killed, or Lotan and or Yam, and the gods that are going to be killing those beings are Marduk, Baal, and individuals like that, right? So they have a similar accounting of what happened in prehistory, but through a polytheist lens and interpretations for their particular religions. So and you have, there's I think it's Virtu in the subcontinent of India. Kishamaya have two of these Leviathan type creatures. Every pantheon in the world had them, so there's something to that.
You talk about weapons. Mahabharata mentions these weapons that could destroy the world also.
Yes, absolutely. And it's really interesting on, okay, if they use these weapons, we ought to see something in the normal archaeological record for it. We really don't see that. But yet these are gods who are in the middle of a war. And if there was a war between the gods, this is probably not a war between the pantheon of gods. This is a war between the loyal angels and the rebellious angels. And it's likely if those weapons out of the Vedas and the Upanishads and all the different Mahabharatas, all the different scriptures out of subcontinent of India, these weapons had the ability to destroy the world. And they probably did in the rebellion. So if you now look at what happens in all of the creation stories around the world, you have the earth being recreated out of chaos, which means that something caused the chaos. And they have a separation of the waters, that show up as the earth and called Middle Earth in the Norse religion and used in the Tolkien version. So that's the ground. But that implies that these waters collapsed. And so in 2 Peter, you have these odd descriptions of the end time that's reserved to be destroyed by fire. But before that, it's talking about an earth that was in the water and out of the water that perished. And most people think that's the flood, except the whole earth didn't perish. only what was on the land. The oceans still stayed alive. The whole planet wasn't destroyed.
Right.
So when was that? It was in the beginning. And in the beginning is the creation of the heaven and the earth. And when the angels are created, as in Psalm 104, and the foundations of the earth were created that can never be destroyed. But if you had a war between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 that destroyed the world, that made it become void and formless, just as you can translate Genesis 1:1 to 1:2 exactly that way out of the Hebrew words, then that would have caused the water to collapse onto the earth and create the chaos. So when God sends his angel, sends his Holy Spirit in Psalms 104 to renew the surface of the earth, you see that Spirit on the earth before the renewal in this scenario, as you follow the line of thinking of the 6 days of creation. And part of that is separating those waters again to create the firmament so you can create life on the earth again. And so that whole story in the subcontinent of India tends to fit when the angelic rebellion likely happened based on some scripture.
Yeah, well, they even show their little g gods in the sky, in their little floating cities, and
Yeah.
it's up there. They're fighting each other,
Yeah.
like in the sky. So they did find Mohenjo-daro has remnants of radiation, and the sand and stone was glassified from immense heat, and only an atomic structure could have done it. It was a small area, but then there's records of people having their nails fall out and their hair fall out and die of radiation disease. So
Yeah.
they have had some advance, because I believe it's a circle, and whatever forbidden knowledge the fallen ones taught to man, it's still the same fallen entities inspiring men to come up with this stuff.
Yes, that's exactly right. So I'm not all that doctrinal when it comes to and sort of dogmatic about how you want to view days 1 through 6, but I'm open to the idea that the angelic rebellion fits better with the alternative translation, and I've got documents on how that translation works. If people want to get a hold of me, I've got 2 documents that work hand to hand, and one actually makes Exodus 20, when you look at what it's talking about in terms of the heavens and the earth that were the heavens that were created in 6 days and the renewal of the earth. It's actually talking about the heaven that's the firmament, and the firmament is actually called heaven in Genesis 1. So there's a good basis for saying the world is a lot older than what we give it credit for, and it starts to answer a lot of questions. And then when you start looking at, we don't know how old dinosaurs are, because we're not always sure science is telling us the truth, but let's say they are older. Let's say they are millions of years ago. If you had a gap in there, as the people like to call it, the gap theory, I like to name it the renewal of the earth based on scripture. We don't know how old the earth was, but these beings were all, for the most part, reptilian, were the dominant species. And it makes you wonder whether or not they had an imagery like the Seraphim angels, who would have been governing the earth at that point in time as well. And now we're told they had feathers, just like you have the feathered serpent.
Yeah.
So they would have been very much looking like Seraphim, and they were giants. So I mean, everything kind of fits that. There's a correlation there.
Do you know that there is a supposed interview with a saurian, a female upright reptilian person, supposedly? And they did this interview, supposedly. I'm taking this with a grain of salt, but I'm only mentioning it because of that. And she claims that they're far superior to humans. They were here long before mankind was, and that the dinosaurs were their creation, and that they had evolved from these dinosaur type creatures. So I can't tell if she's saying they created the dinosaurs or if dinosaurs actually evolved into her. But she does relate. I think she's some kind of fallen being, if they obviously sat down and talked with her.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm familiar with parts of. I'm not with that interview, but the whole concept of the saurian people, and that's exactly the word that they use as being the intelligent dinosaurs, is how they sort of understood it. And I also find it interesting that even after the flood, and I don't think they're the same as these, but who knows? They might be. Maybe somehow, some way, some of them were saved. The cache was a serpent, the Nahash, right? Before it lost its intelligence, before it lost its arms, before it lost its legs, and certainly it wasn't Satan who had that happen to him, because we don't get that. Only happened to the Nahash. And the serpent, it was this walking, talking, intelligent serpentine being. And it would have been, it was already considered by its definition like an enchanter, as a wizard, as a sorcerer when it was deceiving Eve. And it seems to be a most favored being created before Adam and before humans, perhaps in day 4, perhaps in day 5, we're not sure when or how, that was going to be robbed of its preferred status with the creation of Adam.
These are fascinating things, but I want to also say I have no problem with dinosaurs being young either. Like,
Neither do I. Yeah.
No matter what somebody believes, it shouldn't cause division, because there's evidence for both, I believe. And bottom line is, what does Scripture say? I believe Job describes a sauropod, long, like a brachiosaurus or something.
Yep.
So I think that's possible. But these things like T-Rex and stuff, these things were monsters.
Yeah.
I see no point of God creating that, per se, especially not with man. So something's weird with that.
Yeah, there's something very, very weird, and that just sort of suggests that these fallen angels had a world that they were making in their kind of own image, and that they had already rebelled. So it wouldn't be this perfect world that God will show us what he would do,
Right.
without any perversion from disloyal angels that happens after the millennium. So, and the world may have even started off in a way that would be perfect, and then the fallen angels would have perverted it, just like they did before the flood, if you've had an age before where there was another age. So again, either way, whether or not it was then or before the flood, they still did the same thing. That's why I don't get too dogmatic on it.
Mm-hmm. And Satan wanted to be God, so of course he'd make something in his own image. It makes sense to me.
Absolutely.
We've kept you for 2 hours. I wanted to get a couple questions before. We didn't even get into the bloodline of the Grail and the fairy bloodline, but I'm hoping we can schedule you again at your leisure, sir.
Absolutely.
Talk about those. But there's so many rabbit holes. You have so much knowledge. It is so exciting, so much fun to talk to you. So you guys in the chat, if you had a question for Gary, put it in all caps now, please, so that I can ask him. All right, let's see here. Give us here just a second. Yeah, there was so much. What do you got? Tuatha De Danann. That's the fairy people. Is that the?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
Them, and then the bloodline of the Grail, and I want to talk about the sons of Noah and those nations. I mean, there's just so much we could talk about. I saw some questions earlier. Now I can't find them because they were not in caps. So, okay,
Well,
I don't see anything in caps right now. So,
okay. Well, they can send them to you, and I can answer them on the next show.
that's perfect. Now, Ben, you said you had a question for Gary, I think. Okay, here it is. All right, here's 2 questions. Ben, our lovely producer, says, is Gary familiar with the program? Hold on one second. Familiar with the program on the History Channel called The Curse of Oak Island? If so, what do you think of it? I think this is where they'd say the Freemasons buried treasure or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it, and I do write. I think I may even make a reference to Oak Island in the book. But I was listening to a Templar adept, and there are Templar adepts in Canada in some of the organizations, and I was listening to him on a radio show, and he said they're never going to find anything in Oak Island, and this was before the show even started. Um, he said that the treasures that came from Jerusalem did make a stop at Oak Island, which is why they find some things. But they were moved after treaties were set up with the First Nations in North America, which are nobody can go on those lands without permissions. And so they've moved them into various locations on First Nation reserved lands. And nobody's going to find them until they're ready to reveal them.
Wow. So this is just a dangling a carrot that you can never bite, I guess.
Yep. Yep. Well, they've milked that show for quite a few years and not found much.
That's true. How funny is that? Actually, nothing has happened. I've been watching people do nothing but dig, and nothing's happened for years. It says, can Gary expound and support his position that God sent prophets and scriptures to people other than Adamites? Does he mean there are other inspired writings?
Well, that's what other people and other religions, and Islam in particular, believes.
Yeah, okay. So Gary wasn't saying he thinks they're inspired. Yeah. He's saying other religions believe their writings are also inspired.
And my position would be, as I would reconcile that in my own head, is if God wanted to send scripture to other people, that's God's business. It has nothing to do with what I agree with or disagree with. Just as God can save anybody he wants to save, I'm not, that is the domain of the Almighty, and he does what he does because he knows more than we do. So
amen to that. I'm looking here. I think these could kind of go together. One person's wondering if you know Steve Quayle.
Do I know him? Not well. I have spoken to him and I've worked with him. I was hoping to meet him at last year's True Legends conference. I was supposed to speak there at the live, but of course we had to do it on a virtual conference. That's when I did a 2.5 lecture on how you could translate Genesis 1:1 to 1:2, and walked everybody through it via video. I recorded it myself and then had it sent in for the conference. So if people want to have a step-by-step look at that, it'll cost you a little over $100 for the complete DVD set, but I had so much feedback on nobody has explained it that way, that well, and how much it made sense. So if you're interested in that. So yes, I have talked to him. I'm an acquaintance with him, but I've never physically met him.
Yeah, the reason I said this question may be kind of related to him is the Kandahar Giant thing.
Yeah.
Have you heard that story?
And yep, I listened to the interview. Yep. And it was absolutely fascinating. And the descriptions as to the giant, they fit the descriptions so well to what I put in my book, and including their depth, how fast it was, how big it was. Everything was like it had inside information. So they either knew exactly what it was as it was relayed to them, or it actually happened. And I thought the whole interview was credible, even from the military aspect. And everything.
Yeah. It sure sounded like it. Yeah, because most people think. By the way, I think this is a story where the military guys entered a cave. One of them was killed by this 12-foot huge, like, linebacker giant with red hair and 6 fingers, 6 toes, just like it's reported by the Native Americans and in ancient sources. And he killed one of them. And these guys kept shooting with machine guns, and he kept coming at them. Most people would think something that huge would be slow, right? Because they're big.
Yep, they're fast.
They're really fast. And the voice, they say the voice is horrifying, right?
I describe it in the book like the like Atlas yelling from the bowels of the earth, and it just vibrates. They were frightening to all the senses, not only from the voice, but the smell and looking like serpents and other creatures.
Oh yeah, they said he smelled like sulfur and rotting corpses.
Yes.
Oh, can you? And it's that's demonic. But I'm assuming it's because he lives in a cave.
Yeah.
But, you know,
And
eventually.
so so now you know why. Now you know why the royals, again AL, is a transliteration for the king's bloodlines. Why they invented perfume for the royal families.
Really?
Yep. Because that for generations and generations that smell permeated with them, so they needed to be able to cover it up.
So that's genetic.
Yeah. Yep.
Wow. Yeah, I believe the story too. So eventually they aimed at this giant's head and he did die finally.
Yep.
And they claim they took his body over in a plane or helicopter and dropped it in the ocean. And they were told to be quiet about it, change the report, don't mention anything.
Yeah.
Why would
Well, that's why like with Goliath, you have to take the head. That was quite sort of common understanding with the giants. And Rapha not only means a tribe of giant, and not only means a ghost or a spirit, but it also means healer. It's thought that they had self-healing capabilities as part of their genetic makeup, which is why you had to kill them by taking the head.
It would also make sense how people claim they have shot these little gray aliens and come back and the body's gone.
Yeah.
It's disappeared. If they get better and thief or something.
Yep.
Because I think they're all demonic too.
Yep.
But people think spirit beings don't have physical form. They do. They have spirit, terrestrial and
Spiritual.
spiritual bodies.
Yep.
So they're physical. They're just made out of different physical stuff than us. So that was horrifying, and it's horrifying more that they were so traumatized and weren't allowed to speak about it. Anytime they want something covered up, it seems they dump it in the ocean like they did, every time they throw them out there. Let's see. Are you familiar with dinosaur bones being dug up in Western Canada and Western USA? Do you think they could have been the giants you were talking about?
Well, some of them would be confused. Typically they are. But you also have all the other ones that seem to be related to these giant reptilian creatures that weren't giants, right? So there's some of each. Yeah, in the Badlands, that's where they dig up most of the dinosaur bones.
Oh, okay. All right. All right. Somebody, yeah, I think it's weird that they have fossilized human footprints right next to these dinosaur footprints too. That's pretty.
Yeah, that's hard to explain.
All right. So he says, Renee and Gary, do you believe Sethite pastors, that deny this? I'm not going to say that pastor's name. Sorry, Michael. Are purposely deceiving people. I do not think they're purposely deceiving people. I think they've been taught tradition. What about you, Gary?
Well, I get a lot of ministers that get a hold of me and say, can you send me your information on all of that? Because they're not taught this in seminary schools. They're taught that there were Sethites, and so they never question it. They only teach what they're told to teach. And when somebody hits them with information that they know in the back of their mind actually makes sense from what they're reading, and then they hit that sort of cognizant dissonance that they have to either deal with it or suppress it. And so, yeah, I don't think unless they're Gnostic, I don't think they're purposely doing it. I think they're doing what they truly believe based on what they were taught in seminary schools.
Yeah, me too. I was very shocked when my independent fundamental Baptist preacher talked correctly. He taught correctly that the sons of God were actual angels. And I was really surprised that he was. I was impressed that he preached it because I know he wasn't taught it in seminary. Sister Lisa, she's asking how we get a signed copy of his book. He was explaining earlier that because unless you're using a Google search engine, for some reason his website doesn't come up. You just get a blank page. So try to use a Google search engine to access his webpage so you can get a signed copy of his book, because they're playing games. You know, we were talking about how Google, even if you put in a specific search for another website, they'll still gear you toward their own companies, you know. So if that's the case, you can order them at bookstores, and I'll let him tell you where. But if you want a signed copy, make sure if you go to that link, which will be in the description box,
Yep.
that you, if you get a blank page,
Yep.
try it again with a Google Chrome search engine.
Yeah, and you just have to click on the Buy Now button once you get to the website, and you'll get an option to buy a signed copy from me, or you can link over to the Kindle version, or to Amazon, or to Barnes & Noble.
And Ben put the direct link to Gary's website on the lower right of the screen. That's been playing this whole time. So if you just pause the video, you have the direct link for signed copies there for inside and outside the U.S.
Yeah, and I try and mention this as often as possible. A lot of times credit card companies put a foreign purchase hold, so your transaction could get declined, and that's just be through security options. So if you haven't asked them to remove that because you don't buy out of country often, then if it gets declined, and it only takes MasterCard and Visa, by the way, but if it gets declined, that's likely the cause. Like 99% of the time, that's the issue.
That is just terrible. It really is. I mean, they really have just, like my son said, it's an oligarchy. They are just ruling everything and running over everybody that doesn't share their ultra liberal left view. It's crazy to me the things they're doing. Yeah. I've got one viewer, she's practically shadow banned everywhere. She didn't even realize it until I told her. She's posting right then, and I'm like, I can't see it. It's not there. It's not even showing up, you know. So it's horrible. So I think it's good that you have multiple resources. And yeah, you got to keep one of them open, you know, and if Facebook is the one that's easiest for people to contact you.
Yep.
You know? So also, you know, Gary has a Facebook page. What is it under? Just Genesis 6 or?
Yeah, I have a couple of pages that are under Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and then also a group that I participate in. I don't manage the group because I don't have time to do it, but it's called Gary Wayne and the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. So I'll comment on people's not timelines, but the postings that they put on there. If they tag me, I'll come in and I post items in there and interviews in there on a regular basis. So,
well, that's awesome. I'm going to join that. So you guys should come join that also. It's the one that he's kept. Yep. So we can always get in touch with him.
Yep.
Gary, I'm just so happy you come to hang out with us again. You are so fascinating, such a wonderful guest. Your energy's fantastic, just brilliant. And I knew we wouldn't get through all of them, but I just love it when it organically flows into other things. I like having the conversation with you and the chat interacting, and I just really enjoy having you here, and I appreciate it so much. And I'm going to bug you to come see us real soon.
Perfect. Thank you for having me.
And chat room, thank you guys for being kind to one another. As always, you don't have to agree. And when you disagree, you don't have to be disagreeable. So we can always hold a different position and still be kind. Like Paul says, if it doesn't matter what gifts we have or how profound the truth is we're speaking. Without love, we are as clanging cymbals. It's just noise. So thank you so much for being here tonight. If you missed some of the broadcast, it will be on my channel. You can watch it anytime. Again, his links to order autographed copies will be in the description box. And I hope to see you soon. God bless you all. Good night.